Hello, I'm Suzy Morgan. I'm the conservator here at ASU Library, and I am here today to talk to you a little bit about the bindings of the Kelmscott Press books. Most of them came in kind of two versions. They came in the cheaper version and the more expensive version. So there would be one that would be bound in vellum, and you could get the same book in this, blue paper with a linen spine. So this was called a quarter linen binding. The designs for these vellum bindings, as well as the quarter linen binding, were designed by P.J. Cobb Sanderson, who ran the Dove's Bindery in Hammersmith, England, and he was a friend of William Morris. And his kind of origin story is actually pretty interesting because he originally was a lawyer, and he gave up a potential career of being a barrister. He abandoned the bar to become a bookbinder because William Morris's wife, Jane Morris, I think at some dinner party, was like, hey, why don't you learn how to be a bookbinder? Because we don't have a bookbinder in our group. And T.J. Cobb Sanderson was basically like, okay. He helped William Morris out by designing kind of the initial concept for not just the Chaucer, but the Kelmscott Press books. Even though Cobb Sanderson did the design, another bindery actually did the production. There's some interesting correspondence between Cobb Sanderson and William Morris about the changes that Morris made in Cobden's design that sort of he didn't agree with. It's like bookbinding minutia that even I read it and I'm like, I don't know, maybe that's a big change, maybe not. So the interesting thing when the Kelmscott Press started is that bindings like these were not in fashion. So nobody was really using vellum as a binding material for covering books. So actually what books of this time period looked like was something more like this. So what was in fashion before William Morris started his Kelmscott Press enterprise were books bound in leather with gold tooling. They would have a very nice design, gold edges, gilt edges. So what William Morris was trying to do with his Kelmscott Press binding designs was really simplify things. So he wanted them to look very plain. And that's really a callback to something that's, it's been around for a long time because these are not an invention of William Morris, but he's just bringing something back that's been around for a long time and went out of fashion. The vellum bindings are very plain. I mean, the only tooling you'll see on them is on the spine, and there's no decoration on the boards. And really the only kind of visual element besides the material itself and the stamping are these ties. The ties are decorative in a way, but they actually have a structural purpose. So when you sew the text block, the thread is actually going around these silk cords. So the silk cord is under the thread that comes out of the text block. It draws the vellum cover kind of like a coat, right? So if you can imagine kind of sticking your arms through a coat and then pulling it on, similar thing here. And there's one book where he didn't use silk ties, he used leather ties. And it's the very first book, the Story of the Glittering Plain, that the Kelmscott Press published. And then, for some reason, he switched to silk ties. Unfortunately, the silk it gets really fragile over the years. And so we've got several where part of it is just snapped off. But these leather ties stay pretty strong. So this is sort of like they did this once and then thereafter, they switched to using the silk ties. They really are kind of an imitation in all ways. So they even have these little edges, which are called yaps, Y-A-P-P, yap. And they were really meant to kind of provide a little protection for the foredge. Of course, the yaps that he has on these books don't quite go over all the way, but he's really imitating a lot of the different parts of that style. The thing, though, that I think is funny is that end bands were too fancy. So there are no end bands on any of these. And an end band is the little kind of strip of cloth, or like this one has very simple but sewn on end bands. So they go at the top and the bottom of the spine. There's all sorts of different types of end bands. They can be different colors. At this point in bookbinding history, they have no structural purpose at all. They are purely decorative. So they are just there really to make your book look fancy. You can sort of imagine that William Morris agreed that they were too fancy, and he had no end bands on any of these Kelmscott books. I get a lot of questions when I talk about binding materials, especially when I'm talking about vellum books, is what is vellum? And the other word that people often hear is parchment. All vellum is parchment, but not all parchment is vellum. And at this point, parchment and vellum, the difference is really more semantics than anything. Parchment, which we can call all of this, is animal skin that has been prepared and processed solely through mechanical means. So scraping, pulling, stretching, drying, sanding, polishing, which is different than leather because there is some physical mechanical process involved with leather tanning, but tanning is a chemical process. So they kind of start off the same way, and then they end up at a very different place with different working properties. Because it's an animal product, there's often kind of a unique pattern to some of the surfaces. So if you look at some of these in the right light, you can actually see like the veins of the animal. So really no piece of vellum is the same. They all look a little different. It's a character that you don't get with leather because leather has a grain. You would never see this kind of evidence of the animal on leather in that same way. It's also incredibly durable. It can really just take a beating and keep on going. It doesn't scratch up as like leather does. Of course, that also means it has a mind of its own, so it reacts very strongly to changes in temperature and humidity. So over time, some of these, the Kelmscott books have, they start to warp a little. When you are using vellum for a binding material, you have to kind of be aware of that and maybe be a little more like collaborative with the material. But the other thing about vellum too, though, is that it's hard to tool. Doing this gold tooling requires heat. And like I just mentioned, vellum changes and reacts to heat. That's one of the kind of the drawbacks of using vellum as a binding material, or maybe not a drawback, a restriction, a creative restriction, is that you can't decorate it as easily and as ostentatiously as you can with leather. But that's okay because that's what William Morris wanted. He wanted these books to look, very simple, kind of a throwback to an earlier era, which, they were. The thing about bookbinding, though, is that it also has cycles and things come into fashion and go out of fashion and come back again. And you can really see that with the Kelmscott Press books because when William Morris started, these were not fashionable. You can really see that after he started doing this, other people started copying him. Of course, William Morris, like his original idea for the Kelmscott Press books is definitely kind of a harkening back to what I like to call the yield book. It has a lot of the same features and the design elements of books that are from a much earlier time period, right? So from the 16th century, from the 17th century, but this is a 19th century book. Everything old is new again, and then it's old again, and then it's new again. It's history repeating itself.